Racist cop slaps black woman in court. The judge suddenly stands up. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. Officer Derek Hayes, a white police officer known for his cold, authoritative demeanor, had been called to testify in court that morning. The case? A seemingly minor altercation involving a black woman, Tasha Williams, who was accused of disorderly conduct. It was supposed to be a routine day in court, but little did anyone know it would quickly escalate into a moment that would shock everyone in the room. Tasha Williams, standing at the center of the courtroom, was visibly frustrated. Her eyes locked with Officer Hayes as he took the stand, and she could feel the weight of the injustice hanging in the air. Tasha had grown up in a world where the odds were stacked against her, and now, in this very courtroom, she was fighting not just for her innocence, but for her dignity. Her heart raced as the prosecutor questioned her, each word feeling like another weight added to her shoulders. The tension in the room was palpable. Officer Hayes, however, seemed unaffected. His answers were smooth, rehearsed, and filled with the sort of condescension that made Tasha feel small. It wasn't the first time she had faced discrimination, but the sting still hurt every time. As the exchange between the prosecutor and Tasha continued, it became clear that the facts of the case were being twisted. Tasha's words were being misinterpreted, and the courtroom seemed to be siding with Hayes without question. Her frustration grew. It wasn't just the trial. It was the system that allowed people like Hayes to manipulate the narrative. She couldn't stay silent any longer. As the prosecutor asked another question, Tasha stood up abruptly, her voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't right," she shouted, her words echoing in the courtroom. "You're lying, and everyone in here knows it." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward Tasha. Even the judge paused, momentarily taken aback by the outburst. But it was Officer Hayes who reacted first. His face twisted in anger, and with a quick motion, he stepped forward, his hand raised as if to silence her. Tasha froze for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Was this really happening? In front of everyone? Just as Hayes moved closer, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew even tenser. The spectators were now on edge, their eyes darting between the two of them. The tension was almost unbearable, and then, in an instant, something unexpected happened. The judge, who had been quietly observing from behind the bench, suddenly stood up. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at her, wondering what would happen next. As the entire courtroom held its breath, everyone turned their gaze towards Judge Maria Collins. She had been silent throughout the entire trial, observing everything with a calm yet perceptive gaze. But now, the moment had come for her to make her decision. Officer Derek Hayes was still standing, his expression hard and unwavering, his eyes locked on Tasha with a mix of contempt and frustration. Tasha, on the other hand, stood tall, her anger rising with each passing second. The tension in the room was so thick that you could almost feel it pressing against your skin. The judge's movement was swift and deliberate. She pushed her chair back, standing up with authority, her black robe swaying slightly as she stepped forward. The audience, still in shock from the outburst, watched in silence as she approached the center of the room. Her voice, when it came, was firm but calm, carrying the weight of the law with every word. "Officer Hayes," Judge Collins began, her voice cutting through the tension, "I have witnessed many trials, and I have seen many acts of injustice, but what you did here today goes beyond what any courtroom can tolerate. Your actions have not only disrupted these proceedings, but they have also shown a complete disregard for the dignity and rights of the defendant." The words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. Officer Hayes, taken aback by the sudden condemnation, took a step back. His face flushed with anger, but he didn't speak. He stood there, unable to form a response. The judge continued, her voice unwavering. This court will not tolerate any form of discrimination or mistreatment, whether inside or outside this courtroom. You may be a law enforcement officer, but you are not above the law. The room was still. No one dared to make a sound. The tension between the judge and the officer was palpable, and everyone knew that this was a defining moment. Tasha, standing across the room, felt a surge of emotion. She had always known that the system was broken, but now, for the first time, she felt as though there was a chance for change. She had no idea what would happen next, but she could feel the momentum shifting. The judge turned toward the bailiff and spoke with calm authority. "Bailiff, escort Officer Hayes out of this courtroom immediately," she commanded. The bailiff moved swiftly, his hand on Hayes' arm, guiding him towards the door. Hayes didn't resist, though his expression remained angry. As the bailiff led him out of the room, the spectators in the courtroom began to murmur. Some exchanged looks of disbelief, while others nodded in approval, relieved that someone had finally stood up to the injustice. For Tasha, the feeling was bittersweet. She had won a small victory in that moment, but she knew the battle was far from over. As she stood there, her heart still racing, she realized that the fight for equality was a long and difficult road. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone. Judge Collins' actions had sparked something within her, and she knew she would continue to fight for what was right, no matter what the cost. As the courtroom buzzed with the aftermath of Officer Hayes' removal, Tasha stood frozen, her body still tingling with the shock of what had just happened. For a moment, she couldn't fully process the fact that the officer who had wronged her was no longer in the room. The weight of it all was still sinking in. She had expected to face the harsh reality of the system once again, but instead, something incredible had happened. The judge, Maria Collins, had stood up and taken action. For Tasha, it was as if a veil had been lifted. She had always felt like just another face in the crowd, overlooked and disregarded. But now, in this very courtroom, she had been seen. Tasha's heart was still racing, her mind racing through the whirlwind of events. She could hear the murmurs of the spectators in the background, their voices filled with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Some were clearly on her side, while others were still processing what had just taken place. The bailiff returned to the room, his footsteps heavy, and he nodded toward Judge Collins. With a single motion, she sat back down, signaling for the trial to continue. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. There was a new energy in the air. For the first time, Tasha felt that she had a chance. The prosecutor, though visibly flustered, tried to regain control of the proceedings. He cleared his throat, glancing at Tasha with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. But the momentum had already changed. Tasha was no longer the vulnerable woman on trial. Now, she was the one holding the power. She looked over at the defense table, where her lawyer sat with a small but encouraging smile. The lawyer, a middle-aged man named James Porter, had been quietly supportive throughout the trial, but even he seemed taken aback by the events that had unfolded. He leaned over, whispering to Tasha, "You did good. We're one step closer." His words were a comfort, but Tasha knew that this wasn't over. There was still a long road ahead. But in that moment, she felt something that she hadn't felt in years: hope. The judge, Maria Collins, spoke again, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the court. "We will not continue until we have dealt with the matter at hand," she said firmly. Her gaze shifted toward the prosecutor, who nodded reluctantly. "I suggest we take a brief recess while we ensure that the proper protocol is followed." The judge's decision to pause the trial in such an unexpected way was a testament to her commitment to fairness. The courtroom was dismissed for a short break, and Tasha found herself sitting quietly in her seat, processing what had just happened. The prosecutor and the defense counsel exchanged a few words, but Tasha barely noticed. Her focus was on the shift that had taken place. She had been given a voice. The moment felt surreal, as if she had been watching a scene unfold in someone else's life. But it was real, and she was part of it. Tasha knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time, she felt like she was in control of her own story. As she sat there, lost in thought, her lawyer returned to her side, his expression one of quiet determination. "We've got this," he said simply, and for the first time in a long time, Tasha believed him. As the short recess came to an end, the courtroom slowly began to fill back up. The energy in the room had shifted, and there was an undeniable sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Tasha felt it too, her heart beating a little faster as she prepared to face whatever would come next. She had never been the type to back down, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for her freedom. This was a fight for her dignity, for the right to be treated fairly and equally. As she sat quietly in her seat, her lawyer James Porter returned to her side, his expression serious but reassuring. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. Tasha nodded, taking a deep breath. She wasn't sure what the next move would be, but she knew she couldn't back down now. James gave her a brief smile, as if to say he believed in her. "We've got this," he repeated, his words carrying a weight of determination. With that, the judge entered the courtroom, and the room fell silent once more. Judge Maria Collins took her seat at the bench, her gaze sweeping over everyone present. It was clear that the moment had arrived. The trial would continue, but things would not be the same. "Court is now back in session," Judge Collins said firmly, her voice steady and authoritative. "We will proceed with the case, but I want to make it clear that any further disruptions will not be tolerated." Her eyes briefly flicked over to the prosecutor, who looked slightly shaken but nodded in compliance. The prosecutor, trying to regain his composure, stood up and cleared his throat. He looked down at the papers on his desk, visibly searching for his next move. Tasha could feel the weight of his gaze as he turned toward her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she sat tall, her confidence growing with every passing second. The prosecutor began his questioning again, though this time his tone lacked the usual aggression. It was clear that the balance of power had shifted. He tried to focus on the facts, but Tasha could sense his unease. The moment Hayes had been removed from the courtroom had changed everything. For the first time, it felt like the courtroom was finally listening to her. The prosecutor's questioning seemed to drag on, but Tasha didn't let it rattle her. She answered each question calmly, her voice steady and clear. There was no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. She knew that if she showed any weakness now, it would be used against her. Tasha had learned to be strong in the face of adversity, but now it felt different. She was not just fighting for her own innocence. She was fighting for something much bigger. The trial continued, and as the hours ticked by, Tasha began to realize something profound. She wasn't just a passive participant in this process anymore. She had a voice, and she was using it. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, but it no longer intimidated her. Instead, she stood firm, knowing that what she was doing mattered. As the day wore on, the prosecutor's questions began to lose their bite. The defense had managed to get its footing, and it became clear that Tasha's side had the upper hand. The more the prosecutor tried to push, the more he stumbled. His questions grew less sharp, his tone less certain. Tasha didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone was enough. She had come into this trial as just another defendant, but now she was a force to be reckoned with. She had taken control of the narrative, and with each passing moment, she was reclaiming her power. The courtroom was growing quieter by the minute as Tasha continued to hold her ground. She could feel the weight of the prosecutor's stare, the pressure of the situation, but she refused to back down. Every word she spoke was measured, every response calculated. She knew that if she showed any signs of uncertainty, it would be twisted, used against her. But that wasn't going to happen today. Tasha had already proven that she wouldn't be intimidated. The defense team, led by James Porter, had made their case clearly, presenting facts that contradicted the prosecutor's arguments. It was evident to everyone in the room that Tasha's story was starting to resonate. As the hours dragged on, the prosecutor's questions became increasingly scattered. He fumbled with his notes, trying to find the next angle to push, but his confidence was starting to wane. It was clear that the more he questioned, the less certain he became. Tasha's calm, unwavering answers seemed to throw him off balance. It wasn't just the facts that were turning the tide. It was her presence. She wasn't a passive participant anymore. She was in control. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom seemed to shift. The atmosphere had gone from one of uncertainty to one of quiet anticipation. Even the spectators, who had been unsure of the outcome earlier, were now glued to the proceedings. Some exchanged whispers of support, while others watched with wide eyes, impressed by Tasha's strength. Tasha could feel their eyes on her, but for once, she didn't mind. She didn't feel like the defendant anymore. She felt like the one in charge of her own fate. The prosecution's case was slowly crumbling, and Tasha knew that her story was being heard. The judge, Maria Collins, remained silent but observant, her eyes occasionally flicking between the prosecutor and Tasha. She had been the one to make the pivotal decision to stand up to Officer Hayes earlier, and Tasha couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward her. The judge's actions had given Tasha a sense of hope, a belief that there were still people in positions of power who cared about justice. The trial was nearing its conclusion, and Tasha could feel her nerves settling. She wasn't nervous in the way she had been at the beginning of the trial. This time, she felt sure. Sure that the truth was on her side. Sure that the tides had turned in her favor. The prosecutor's attempts to break her down had failed, and now it was only a matter of time before the jury would deliberate. Tasha didn't know what the final verdict would be, but in this moment, she felt as though she had already won. The victory wasn't in the hands of the jury or the judge. It was in her ability to stand up for herself, to be heard, and to push back against the system that had tried to silence her for so long. As the trial continued to wind down, Tasha felt a sense of peace wash over her. Whatever happened next, she had already proven something powerful. She had proven that no matter how hard they tried to hold her down, she would always rise. And as the prosecutor gave his final remarks, Tasha's resolve only grew stronger. She was ready for whatever came next. As the prosecutor wrapped up his final remarks, Tasha remained composed, her mind sharp, and her resolve stronger than ever. She could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that everything was about to come to a head. The case had dragged on for hours, but the end was now in sight. Tasha's eyes glanced over at her lawyer, James Porter, who gave her a reassuring nod. The quiet confidence in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. They had done everything they could, and now it was time to let the jury decide. The courtroom was eerily still, the tension hanging thick in the air. The spectators were holding their breath, waiting for the final word from the judge. Judge Maria Collins sat silently at the bench, her hands resting calmly on the surface in front of her. Her face was unreadable, but Tasha knew that the judge had been watching every move, every word. For Tasha, this trial had been a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt voiceless in the face of injustice. She had come into the courtroom as a defendant, unsure of what would happen next. But now, she stood with her head held high, knowing that no matter the outcome, she had fought back. Judge Collins finally spoke, her voice cutting through the silence. "The jury will now deliberate," she announced, her tone firm and final. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. This was it. She exchanged a glance with James, and he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We've done our part," he said quietly. "Now we wait." The jurors filed out of the courtroom, and the tension in the room only seemed to grow. Outside, the hallways were filled with murmurs as the spectators and reporters waited for the decision to be made. Tasha sat in her seat, her hands clenched together, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. She had spent so much time fearing the worst, but now that the moment had arrived, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. This trial had been about more than just her. It had been about showing the world that people like her wouldn't be silenced, that their voices mattered. The minutes stretched on as the jurors deliberated. Time seemed to move both slowly and quickly at the same time, the uncertainty hanging heavy in the air. Tasha's thoughts drifted back to the moment when Officer Hayes had been removed from the courtroom, and she couldn't help but smile to herself. That was the moment she had realized things were changing. It was the moment she had known that, despite the odds, she could make a difference. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jurors returned to the room. The room fell silent again as the foreperson of the jury stood up and approached the judge. Tasha could feel her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding. This was the moment. The foreperson handed the judge the verdict, and the entire room waited in anticipation. Judge Collins carefully reviewed the paper in front of her, then looked up at the courtroom. Her gaze swept over the people gathered, lingering for a moment on Tasha. Then, without hesitation, she spoke. "We have reached a verdict," Judge Collins announced, her voice steady. The entire room leaned forward, the air thick with anticipation. In the case of the people versus Tasha Williams, we find the defendant not guilty of all charges. A wave of relief washed over Tasha. She had done it. She had fought back and won. The tears she had been holding back finally came. But they were tears of joy, tears of triumph. Her journey was far from over, but in that moment, Tasha felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. The courtroom was filled with an overwhelming sense of relief and disbelief as Judge Collins' words echoed in Tasha's ears. Not guilty of all charges. The verdict was everything Tasha had hoped for and more, yet she could hardly believe it. The weight of the moment, the struggle, and the uncertainty all seemed to lift from her shoulders in an instant. Tasha's body trembled as she stood up, the reality of the decision sinking in. Her lawyer, James Porter, stepped beside her, a proud smile on his face. "We did it," he whispered, his voice full of quiet satisfaction. Tasha looked around the room, her eyes briefly meeting those of the jury members as they filed out of the courtroom. They looked calm, composed, but she knew they had made the right choice. For the first time in this entire ordeal, Tasha felt like she wasn't just another face in the system. She wasn't just a statistic or a victim. She was a person who had been heard. The courtroom, though still buzzing with quiet conversations, felt strangely peaceful to Tasha. It was as if the storm that had raged for so long inside her had finally calmed. She could feel the eyes of the spectators on her, but this time, it didn't make her nervous. It felt like validation. The struggle had been real, but she had overcome it. "You're free, Tasha," James said, giving her a moment to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. She nodded, taking a deep breath. The relief felt almost surreal. Outside, the air was crisp and clear, the streets seemingly brighter than they had been in a long time. Tasha stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the decision still echoing in her mind. She had won, but it wasn't just a win for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been oppressed, for everyone whose voice had been ignored or silenced. As she walked down the courthouse steps, Tasha felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had fought for herself, yes, but she had also fought for justice. She had proven that the system could work for those who dared to stand up and fight back. The world wasn't perfect, far from it, but today Tasha had seen a glimpse of what was possible when one person found the courage to challenge the status quo. She felt the weight of history behind her, the voices of those who had come before her, who had fought battles of their own. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. As she stepped into the bright sunlight, Tasha couldn't help but feel a small, yet powerful, smile spread across her face. She had won not just a trial, but a battle against the very systems that had once tried to keep her down. And though her journey was far from over, Tasha knew that this victory, this moment of justice, was a step toward a future where her voice would always be heard. The days that followed the trial were a whirlwind for Tasha. The media coverage of her case exploded, and her name was now in the headlines across the country. People praised her for standing up, for challenging the system that had long been tilted against her. But Tasha didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had finally been allowed to breathe again. The victory, while sweet, didn't change the fact that so many others were still fighting battles just like hers. The fight for justice didn't end with her case, and she knew that. Tasha sat in her apartment one afternoon, reflecting on everything that had happened. The courtrooms, the lawyers, the pressure. It all felt like a distant memory, yet the emotions of that day still lingered. The feeling of standing tall in front of everyone, the sense of power that came from being heard. It was something she would never forget. But as the news cycle moved on, Tasha began to realize how much her story had touched others. She started receiving letters and messages from people across the country. Some were from strangers, others were from people who had been in similar situations. They thanked her for being brave, for giving them hope. Tasha couldn't help but feel humbled by their words. She never imagined that her small act of resistance would create such a ripple effect. One afternoon, Tasha met with James Porter, her lawyer, at a local coffee shop. She hadn't seen him since the trial, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude toward him. He had believed in her when no one else had. "You did something incredible, Tasha," James said, looking at her with respect. "But remember, this is just the beginning." Tasha nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The journey she had started wasn't just about winning a case. It was about changing the narrative, about showing that justice could be served, no matter how much it seemed out of reach. "What happens next?" Tasha asked, her voice steady but curious. "Well," James began, "you've got a voice now. You can use it to make a real difference. People are listening, and you can be the change that so many others need." Tasha thought about his words for a long time after that meeting. She had been given a platform, a chance to speak up for others who couldn't. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly. She began to reach out to organizations that fought for social justice, offering her time and her story. Tasha realized that this was her calling now. She wasn't just going to be the woman who won a case. She was going to be an advocate, someone who helped shape the future one step at a time. As the months passed, Tasha continued to speak out. She became a voice for those who felt voiceless, using her experience to push for change in the legal system and beyond. The road wasn't easy, but Tasha had learned that nothing worth fighting for ever was. She knew there would be setbacks and challenges ahead, but she was ready. She had already fought and won, and now she was ready to keep fighting for herself, for those who came before her, and for those who would come after. Inevitably, the challenges that Tasha faced as she began to use her voice were not over. Despite her victory, despite the outpouring of support, there were still obstacles ahead. As Tasha became more involved in advocating for social justice, she realized how deep the issues ran. The road she had chosen was not a smooth one, but it was one she was determined to travel. At first, the work felt overwhelming. She was invited to speak at rallies, community meetings, and even to share her story at conferences. Everywhere she went, people were eager to hear from her, to understand what she had gone through. But Tasha also began to see the cracks in the system that she had once hoped could be fixed. Even though she was making a difference, there was still so much to do. The injustices she had once experienced were far from rare. They were common. As she spoke out, Tasha found herself battling both the expectations of others and her own doubts. There were days when she questioned if she was truly making an impact, if her efforts were enough. The world felt vast, and the issues she wanted to address felt endless. But with each conversation, each speech, she grew stronger. She met other people who had gone through similar experiences, and together, they formed a network of advocates fighting for change. Through the conversations, the shared stories, and the quiet moments of reflection, Tasha came to understand that change wasn't just about one moment. It wasn't about one verdict or one victory. Change was about the collective work of many, working together, each of them doing their part. One of the most powerful moments in Tasha's journey came when she returned to the courtroom. It wasn't for another trial, but for a ceremony where she was honored by a local organization for her courage. Standing there, looking out at the crowd, Tasha realized that she had become a symbol of something bigger than herself. She had fought a battle, and in doing so, she had become part of a movement that would continue long after her story had faded from the headlines. But that was okay. She wasn't in this for the recognition. Tasha was in this for the people, for the ones who felt invisible, for the ones who felt that their voices didn't matter. She had once been one of them, and now she was one of the ones who could make the difference. As the ceremony concluded, people lined up to thank her. They shared their stories with her, many of them tearful, grateful that someone had taken the time to listen. Tasha knew that the work was far from done. There would always be more people to fight for, more stories to hear. But for the first time in her life, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had found her calling, and she knew that her journey was only beginning.